Not only do we hear out of the mouths of babes expressions from our children, but we also hear at times some very clever expressions from children. The following ones, as they relate to the 4th of July. One 11-year-old raised the question, what did King George think of the American colonists? His answer, he thought they were revolting. A teacher asked the child, what did George Washington say to his men before they crossed the Delaware River? The child answered, get in the boat. One child, in boasting about his relatives, said that my great-grandfather fought with Napoleon, my grandfather fought with the Germans, my father fought with the Americans. His friend replied, your relatives couldn't get along with anybody, could they? When I was serving as a youth director of a North Shore suburban Chicago congregation, one of the members approached me and said to me, if you transfer to Princeton Seminary, I will pay your entire tuition. Well, it was an offer one could hardly turn down, but I was already enrolled at a Chicago area seminary and decided to stay. But the point of this story is that right after he made the offer, he said to me, if you decide to do it, you will have the opportunity to provide tuition for someone else when you arrive at a station in life when you're able to do that. In other words, today you get, tomorrow you give. Not every child growing up has the benefit of receiving tender, loving care and support from his or her parents, but many do, as we know. I know I did. And it's still something I want to pass on to my children and grandchildren. I received a lot, and there is still time to give a lot. And I should say not just to my family, but to society in general. I grew up in a great church family. I had some wonderful mentors in the congregation, some of whom had a great influence on my life. I can show my gratitude by giving back to our congregation financially. My college also had a huge impact on my life. So when the college asked for my support, it is my duty to respond cheerfully and not grudgingly. As Americans, we consider the great gifts we have been given by our national ancestors who paved the way so we could live in a land unparalleled anywhere else in the world. An economy and an infrastructure providing an enormous quality of life, a wide-ranging safety net for those in need, a national defense unrivaled anywhere in the world, freedom of religion, freedom to worship wherever we please, an incredibly generous network of philanthropic and charitable giving, and a breathtaking variety of landscape that provides us all great joy as we travel throughout the country. And most importantly, opportunity for all. So on this weekend, leading up to the celebration of our nation's independence, and since we are beneficiaries of such a magnificent heritage, and we continue to reap benefits from that same heritage, I believe it is as good as any time to talk about the obligations of giving back since we have received so much. Paul teaches us in Philippians, in our lesson today read by Paul, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. The psalmist also writes, what can I return to the Lord for all his goodness to me? Coach Schneider, in his sermon last Sunday, talked about the importance of giving to others, reminding us that even on the road to the cross, Jesus was still reaching out to others. And shortly after the coach's sermon, two of our members told me that they had visited one of our members at the Stony Brook Retirement Center as a result of Coach Schneider's encouragement to give to others, to give back. It segues into the unselfishness theme that President John F. Kennedy shared in his 1961 inaugural address. The film clip at the beginning of the service that we have watched before at this time of the year. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. President Kennedy, himself a World War II veteran, whose actions in saving crew members when his PT-109 was shot and sunk by the Japanese constituted courage and selflessness. And as we know, there has been a pattern of these virtues over the generations that has lifted this nation to the heights never thought possible in the history of humanity. Starting with the Revolutionary War heroes who overcame enormous odds to gain independence from England, and the many wars that followed, and the many sacrifices that were made. And then all these scientific initiatives and inventions and risks so you and I could live better lives. As an example, in creating the polio vaccine in 1952, Jonas Salk tested the vaccine first on himself, then on his wife, and then on his 3 children, boiling the needles in the syringes on his stovetop. So many risks, so many rewards for millions of people. Writer George Will wrote that recently, that in the 3,059-day Revolutionary War, 1 out of 10 Americans who fought died. A higher proportion of the nation's population than perished in any other conflict than the Civil War. He wrote that the soldiers died from battle, disease, or vile British prisons. And he added, the fate of the continent was determined by an astonishingly small number of combatants. And so we move along in this century. As we move along in this century, what will our attitudes be to give back, not only to our nation, but to others, understanding and recalling the litany of sacrifices and risk taken for us, making the transition from getting to giving, and adhering to Jesus' words, it is more blessed to give than it is to receive, reminds us of one of our chief callings in life. We are close enough, my friends, to Fort Riley to understand the sacrifices that hundreds of thousands of men and women make every day to defend our nation from outside threats to freedom. This is giving back to the nation in a huge way. We can learn from this example by giving back ourselves in a way that takes the focus off of what we want and instead of what others need. I wrote in the last newsletter that in our recent trip to Israel, we were reminded of the mandatory military service for young people in Israel. 32 months for men, 24 months for women. The point is that they are serving their country. They are creating a common bond of giving rather than taking, similar to the bond that has been created between those who have served in the United States Armed Forces today and yesterday. The late Senator John Glenn, the first person to orbit the Earth, circling it 3 times in 1962, was also a Presbyterian elder, serving as an elder in the National Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. He said, we are more fulfilled when we are involved in something bigger than ourselves. And to me, there is no greater calling if I can inspire young people to dedicate themselves to the good of mankind. And if I've done that, I've accomplished something. Understanding all of this, I believe that we as Americans today kind of need to tweak our narrative, which focuses, I believe, too much on the getting from our country and not on the giving. Instead of expecting our country to do things for us, we should expect more of ourselves to give back to our nation and communities to strengthen them even more. We show our gratitude to those who have paved the way for us by paving the way for those coming behind us. We must remember that nations don't become stronger by giving away more things. They become stronger when their citizens give back in a form of service and sacrifice. David Brooks, in his recent book, The Second Mountain, writes about the German psychiatrist Dr. Viktor Frankl, who ended up in a Nazi concentration camp. He realized then that his career questions, what do I want from life? What can I do to make myself happy? Are not the proper questions. The real question, he said, is what is life asking of me? Dr. Frankl said it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. And so if we look at our relationship to life in terms of what is expected of us rather than what we should receive from others, it can be a game changer in all areas of life. Perhaps as Americans, we can take a lesson from entrepreneur, philanthropist, Scottish-American industrialist Andrew Carnegie, who came to America from Scotland in the 19th century and beginning work as a worker in a textile mill for $1.20 a week. Later, he worked in a telegraph office and was promoted to telegraph operator at $20 a month. Later, he invested in a sleeping car company, and then an oil company, and then a bridge company, and then he invested in the steel business. His later steel businesses coming together to form Carnegie Steel, and some of you know he became the wealthiest man in the world. 1889, he published his Gospel of Wealth, arguing that the wealthy have a moral obligation to serve as stewards for society. In describing how the highest form of life should be achieved, he indicated that it would be accomplished by laboring for the good of our fellows. This seemed to be Mr. Carnegie's way of transitioning from the getting to the giving. By 1911, he had given away 90% of his fortune, $350 million. As an example, what used to be right down the street, the old limestone library on Points, 1903, Mr. Carnegie gave $10,000 for that building, in addition to contributions to thousands of other libraries across America. It's when the getting, you see, turns into the giving. The most recent spring commencement ceremonies of the all-male African-American Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, Robert F. Smith announced during his graduation address just last month that his family would pay off the student loan debt for all the graduates of the historically black college's this time graduating class. He said to the class, "On behalf of the 8 generations of my family who have been in this country, we're going to put a little fuel in your bus." He then later added, "I will never forget that my path was paved by my parents, by my grandparents, by generations of African Americans I will never know. Their struggles, their courage, their progress allowed me to strive and to achieve. It's incumbent on all of us to pay this inheritance forward. In principle, not unlike the unwritten terms of the offer the gentleman from Chicago offered to me to pay my seminary education, at the same time making a point that you will have the opportunity to do the same thing later in your life. Robert F. Smith is another great American story that continues to build the foundation of generosity in our nation. Paul writes in Galatians, read for us this morning by Paul, that we were called to freedom. But don't turn that freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another. For it's not in the taking, it's in the giving. It's not in the tightening of the circle of opportunity, it's in the broadening of the circle. It's not in the entitlement, it's in the obligation. It's not in the getting, it's in the generosity. God bless America.